First English colony in America. That needs some qualifying, actually. Virginia is the first successful English colony on the mainland of North America. First successful English colony on the mainland of North America. I say successful, for the English had, in years prior, attempted to establish a colony just off the coast of what's now North Carolina at a place called Roanoke. Anybody know what happened to those people?
They disappeared.
Disappeared. We don't know what happened to those people exactly. You could speculate, of course. Killed by Native Americans, dead from disease. Who knows? But they disappeared more or less without a trace. So the people that are about to establish this little town of Jamestown that will become the heart of the colony of Virginia, they got that kind of hanging over their heads. And it looms really large in the early years because, as you're going to see, this venture goes really badly for the first few years. And I said first successful English colony on the mainland of North America. England, as Spain and France and the Netherlands, they all had successful colonies by this time in the Caribbean. The English had a colony of Barbados and another at Jamaica. And would eventually have the Bahamas too. But they wanted to establish a mainland colony, and the first one to stick is Jamestown, which becomes the colony of Virginia. And this is 1606. Now, let me ask you, do you know when the Italian explorer Christopher Columbus, sailing for Spain, when he made landfall on what he thought was the East Indies, Indonesia? He thought he was just around the corner from Japan. Later, others began to realize he had stumbled upon an entirely new world. When did that happen? 1492, right? And here we are, 1606. So it's been over 100 years since the Spanish had begun to explore and colonize this new world, followed by the Portuguese and followed by the French. The Spanish had shown over the course of those 100 years, when they conquered the Aztec Empire in Mexico, they conquered the Inca Empire in Peru, they enslaved Indians by the hundreds of thousands and put them to work where they found gold and silver in the earth. And they made a fortune. So it's been 100 years of watching these Spanish galleons, these giant ships, come back from the New World loaded with gold and silver. The French, I do have a map on there. Good for me. And I stole a laser pointer with a good battery in it from another classroom. Here's the Spanish Empire in the New World. So they actually, Columbus, his first voyage took him to the Bahamas here, later to Cuba. Cuba becomes a Spanish colony. They branch out from there to Mexico, Central America, portions of South America. Brazil is colonized by the Portuguese. And the Spanish sent expeditions up the coast of what's now California and into this desert and mountainous area here, looking for an El Dorado, a city of gold, looking for some other powerful Native American civilization like the Aztecs, and of course they don't find it. So they essentially leave the rest of this alone. Now they did have Florida over here. By have, I mean they established a few outposts, as at St. Augustine down here, and control those at least. But the point is, the rest of North America is left for others to explore, and so the French end up here in the St. Lawrence River Valley, where they established Quebec and Montreal in what's nowadays Canada. And they actually established relatively friendly relations with the local Native Americans and established a lucrative fur trade. They trade things with the Indians and receive in return things like deer skins and beaver pelts that are useful in textile industry. So they have shown the example of establishing lucrative trading operations with Native Americans, in this case the fur trade. And then there's the Caribbean, where both the French and the Spanish and the Dutch and the English all have colonies. The Spanish have Cuba. They have the eastern half of the island here of Hispaniola, which they call Santo Domingo. The French control the western half of that island, what they call the same name, but in French, Saint-Domingue. The English, I mentioned, have Jamaica right here, and they have the tiny island of Barbados at the lower tip of the Lesser Antilles. The French have some of the islands in between there. The Dutch have an island known as Curacao down here. Every one of those islands is being used to cultivate sugar cane. Sugar was something that Europeans used to get from India, but with the discovery of the New World, with the death of the Indians who had occupied those islands, and with the climate and soil, they realized they can grow it themselves. And I'm going to put an asterisk on grow it themselves and come back to it later. But first, let me back up and say, with the death of the Indians, by this time that we're starting at today, in the 1600s, going back to 1492, in that span of time, the Caribs, from which we get the word Caribbean, Native Americans, the Tainos, those peoples with whom Columbus had initially made contact, they're all dead. Some of them killed in their enslavement by the Spanish or warfare with the Spanish, but the vast majority of them dead from what? Disease, particularly smallpox. Diseases that had not existed in this part of the world prior to Europeans coming over, and that therefore Native Americans had no acquired immunity, that is, no ability to resist them whatsoever. And so what's kind of deadly for peoples in Europe and Africa and Asia is catastrophically deadly for these people. That opens up those islands of the Caribbean for cash crop cultivation, especially sugarcane. So, by the 1600s, if England is thinking strongly about expanding their colonial operations in America, they have examples of how you might make money doing that. Find mineral resources like gold or silver. Establish lucrative trade with the Indians like the French had, or grow cash crops. Which one was the Virginia Company going to benefit from? They didn't know, but you'll get there and find out. Virginia Company is what they call a joint stock company. Early precursor to like an LLC or a limited liability corporation, where a group of investors can pool their resources, their capital, and they can share in the risk of a risky venture. To sail to the New World with a charter from the king, granting you certain lands that actually belong to or are inhabited by and hunted on by Native Americans, of course. But granting you that land to establish a little town in the early months while you live on the ship, and then from that town branch out and find some way to make a profit for the company. And let me stress that. The purpose of establishing this colony was to make a profit. What was the point of Virginia? Profit. And I'm going to juxtapose that with what we see on Tuesday. I don't think I will see you all's exact faces on Tuesday, but you will see mine. And when we talk about, this is, by the way, this is not the Pilgrims or the Puritans. This is before that. Tuesday I'll talk Pilgrims and Puritans, Plymouth and Massachusetts. That looks a little bit different. Here there is a singular focus on finding some way for return on investment for the Virginia Company, i.e. to make a profit, which would of course be beneficial to the king and to Parliament and to England generally speaking. Who's making the trip? Who are these people? Well, it's mostly single men. I mean, it's almost exclusively single men. So they're not a self-sustaining group to begin with. A lot of them are from wealthy, sort of well-off families, maybe even pseudo or aristocratic families. And you might have to ask yourself, why would somebody from a well-off aristocratic family undertake a 2-month journey across the ocean and risk death in so many ways? The answer lies partly in the system of inheritance at the time, which is known as primogeniture, which meant that, generally speaking, the firstborn son inherited everything, especially and particularly the land. Aristocratic families at that time were well off and well known and powerful because of the land that they owned, and it went to the firstborn son. If you're the second or thirdborn son, you better join the army or something. You better perhaps lower yourself and go into one of the professions or something. But now the new world opens up this possibility that you could get your own land. The land is the thing that draws people to the new world. Of course, all you got to do is take it from the Native Americans. Of course, if you were the daughter of one of those families, what were you expected to do? Right, marry some other firstborn son of some other family, right? So it's a lot of those second and thirdborn sons from well-off families, and they bring with them sometimes servants who are also single men. There are some craftsmen, of course, and artisans that come along with the first group. This is important if you're going to try to build a town from scratch. Obviously, there are going to be captains of these early ships that are adept at seafaring, and merchants, officials of the Virginia Company, maybe an Anglican priest or two from the Church of England. Hey, what's up? I am. You're good, man. Yeah, come on in. No worries. Yeah, find a seat wherever. I kind of rattle off all different kinds of people who were along with this first wave, this first group settling here. I didn't mention one particular walk of life, one particular kind of person that you might have wanted to have with you if you're going to settle in the middle of nowhere, build a town from scratch, and try to live off the land. What? Farmers. There are no farmers in this first wave of people. There is essentially nobody who has much of a clue what they're doing when it came to tilling the earth, planting crops, growing and cultivating and harvesting them for their own survival. Particularly important is that the major staple food of this land is not the same as the one they come from. It's corn. Grown for centuries by the Native Americans of this area, who, as we'll see, for about the first 10 years or so, do not get along with these colonists. This is not the Thanksgiving story of the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. And as we'll see, even that story was kind of a false lead. Two, you've got this gender imbalance. There are almost no women in the first wave. And so there's all kinds of problems from the start. In fact, there are other problems too. Now, they established Jamestown a few miles up the river that they call the James River. And I move forward, I'll have a better map, and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Their thinking was, we got to build a Palisades fort here because we're worried about maybe being attacked by the local Indians, but also the Spanish they thought could be nearby, and the English and the Spanish were longtime enemies too. Now, I don't know that they had a great grasp of the fact that they're right here and St. Augustine is way the hell down here, nor maybe did they have a great grasp of the fact that St. Augustine didn't have anything there, but maybe some merchants and a few priests trying to convert the Indians to Catholicism. But they built it several miles up the river. The significance of that is they built the town in the immediate vicinity of a swamp, which has mosquitoes, which carry diseases like malaria. And so what we're going to see, given everything I've laid out in the first couple of years, most of these people, in fact, die from starvation and disease. 30 people died on the ship before they even got the damn town built. Out of about 120 in this first group. So I've learned to take absolutely nothing for granted when it comes to geography. And geography is important to me, but they don't teach it anymore. So forgive me if I'm sometimes insulting and be like, yeah, this is where England is. But this is where England is. This is Europe. These are the British Isles. That's Ireland. This is the island of Britain. Scotland is there, and England is right here. They sail west, and they land here in the region known as the Chesapeake, where Chesapeake Bay is, and establish this colony that will be known as Virginia, named for whom? Do you know whom Virginia is named for? Not a woman named Virginia. Yeah.
Wasn't it like the Queen or something?
Yes. The Queen Elizabeth, one of the daughters of Henry VIII, who becomes known as the Virgin Queen because she never married and she died without an heir, without a child. So she's thought to or said to have been a virgin. Now we could debate whether she was actually literally a virgin or not, but the point is she died without having married or having had children, so hence the Virgin Queen, hence Virginia. I'm not going to talk about the origins of all of the colonies, but while we're looking at this map of the Chesapeake region, this is Chesapeake Bay. This is the river they call the James River for King James, who becomes king after Elizabeth, James I of Scotland. And there's Jamestown. Notice how it's miles upriver, thinking that will be some sort of natural defense if the Spanish ever attacked. But again, in the immediate vicinity of a swamp. In some years later, they would establish a colony here, as some Englishmen would, that they named for Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, Maryland. It was initially a colony intended to be a haven for English Catholics at a time where Protestants and Catholics were not getting along in England. Let me indulge myself, as I will do in here, as you'll see from time to time. We're not Egypt. Look at the Nile River basin, though. Sail across. Note where Bermuda is right there. I'll come back to that. There's our nation's capital, which of course did not exist at the time. There's the Potomac, Rappahannock, the York, and now the James. Big cities here on the coast nowadays, obviously not there at the time. Here's the old Jamestown settlement, most of which is gone, but they built a little replica town. Complete with the old Palisades fort and everything, and what it may well have looked like. Anybody been there? I haven't either, which is sad. As a historian, this is all replica, and they do like living history there, with people like pretending to be colonists. It's kind of silly, but in any case, what it may well have looked like. Big ass river. So that's where we are, and it will grow out from there. Despite these early struggles, now the local Native Americans were known to the colonists as the Powhatan, named after their paramount chief, who ruled over they and their neighboring peoples. His name is Powhatan, and they refer to these people as the Powhatan. An agricultural people living in a series of smallish villages, hunting local deer and fowl, fishing in local waters, and growing corn. They are in immediate conflict with the colonists. They do not trade with them corn. They do not teach them to grow corn or how and where to fish, contributing, along with the reasons I mentioned earlier, to a staggering death toll of these colonists in the first 2 years. And I never will ask you to give me these numbers back, but just so you know, of the 120 who came over in this first wave, within 2 years there are 38 of them left. 38 people out of 120, imagine. They keep, though, sending resupply convoys. Each year there will be a new ship, comes into the river and brings new people and resupply. That is the only reason why this settlement hangs on, because they just keep sending more people and continue to resupply it from England. But for 2 more years, things do nothing but go from bad to worse, such that the years 1609 and 1610 are known as the starving times, a title which more or less speaks for itself, where people are starving to death in droves, to the point of a few reported incidences of cannibalism among these people. Of the 500 people who came over in the first 4 years, 500 people, 60 survived. 60 people out of 500 survived those first 4 years and those 2 years known as the starving times. Now, they did briefly make peace with the Palatine, which sort of at the most critical time helps them hang on. They will end up back at war with the Palatine in 1610. But for a year there in between, they did briefly make peace, which helps them hang on, and able to survive basically to the next resupply convoy, until in the middle of the starving times, the one that was supposed to arrive, the third resupply convoy, never showed up, or looked like it was never going to show up, because the ship, unbeknownst to the people, miserable people suffering in Jamestown, had been caught up in a hurricane. And, you know, nowadays in a modern ocean-going vessel, you wouldn't want to get caught up in a hurricane. Imagine in a wooden sailing ship of the 17th century what that might be like. It's actually a stroke of incredible fortune that they were shipwrecked on the island of Bermuda, which I pointed out earlier, out in the middle of nowhere. Some of them died, as you might imagine, but those that survived lived on the island of Bermuda for the better part of a year, took the wreckage of the ship and built a new, smaller ship. And those that had survived that actually do continue on west later, and like a year late show up in Jamestown. Imagine if you had been in Jamestown in the middle of those starving times, waiting for this resupply ship, and finally a year late it makes it there, and you're like, oh, thank God you've come with supplies. And they're like, well, actually, no. We had to use what supplies we had to survive this year as we were shipwrecked on a remote island out in the middle of the ocean. Sorry, now you have more mouths to feed, but no more supplies. And so we took another resupply convoy and another, along with some changes in leadership. A man named Captain John Smith installs a sort of rigid military discipline among the colonists, holding everyone accountable for doing their part. Reinforcements come to help them fight off the Palatine in this, what's known as the First Anglo-Palatine War, which lasts from 1610 to 1614. And so it just takes sustained sending more people and more supplies over there year in and year out for the settlement to survive. They do eventually make peace in 1614 with the Palatine, at a time in which finally they had established an agricultural system, enough farms around the town that they could sustain themselves in terms of food production. So by about 1614, they kind of settled in. One of the elements of the peace is kind of passed down in lore. See, I'm old, I'm about to be 40, and things that I think were like a year or two ago turned out to be like 15 years ago. When was that Disney Pocahontas movie? Okay, so not that long ago then. Help me out.
Pocahontas? That was like in the 90s.
Are you shitting me?
No.
But you guys know about it at least,
Yeah.
right? Okay. God, see what I mean? I'm like, this is something from your lifetime, and no, this is like literally before y'all were born. The Disney Pocahontas is from the 90s.
I'm pretty sure, but like everybody's watching, it's like a Disney movie, so.
Okay, so even something you would see, years later. So yeah, one of the people who was on the shipwrecked ship, the Sea Venture, which, by the way, William Shakespeare wrote a play about that incident. His name is John Rolfe. His name is down there at the bottom there. Part of the peace that they brokered with the Powhatan is for John Rolfe, his wife died in the whole shipwreck deal and the Island of Bermuda episode. So when he gets to Virginia, he's single, and he marries Powhatan's daughter, who is Pocahontas. And that was part of the sort of peace deal, yeah.
1955 to be exact.
Say it again.
1955 to be exact.
Oh, the 55?
I mean, 1995 to be exact.
95, okay. I was going to say, man, I ain't that old. Right. 1995, you were right. Well, that's ridiculous. So, I ought to know better. I mean, I was only 14 myself at that time. So, anyway, all right. I have no sense of time. That we have established. So, yeah, Rolfe marries Pocahontas, and briefly, the Powhatan and the English are at peace, and the settlement grows. As you can see, the town itself grows, and then farms and plantations are established some miles outside of the town so that they can sustain themselves. And they enlarge their footprint, having taken more Powhatan land, in other words. But then in 1622, Powhatan dies, and his younger brother becomes the paramount chief of his people. That is that man, Opachancanoughs. And he sort of takes stock of the situation with himself now in charge. And he can see, he's seen for himself in the preceding 16 years this settlement grow and grow and grow because they just keep sending more people over. He's seen his people lose land to these colonists. He's seen them bring over technological advantages that the Powhatan don't have, like firearms and steel armor and implements and weapons. He knows that they have advantages like that. He knows there have been outbreaks of disease too. He knows that his people are more susceptible to these diseases that these people bring over. At that moment, though, in 1622, despite the fact that the colony had grown to about 1,000 colonists, he knows that the Powhatan, they still have one single advantage over the English, and that's number. There were, at that moment, still more of the Powhatan than there were of the English. But in Opachancanough's mind, he begins to think, what if that changes? What happens when they just keep sending people more and more and more, and it gets to the point where we don't even have the advantage of numbers anymore? He's thinking that's an existential threat to my people, a threat to our existence, if that were to happen. And so he makes the decision to engage in an all-out surprise assault on the colonists in an attempt to wipe them out. An attempt to either kill them all or kill enough of them that they would decide to leave. And I say surprise assault. This occurs on a day when they had been at peace for, 8 years. And so it would not be uncommon for Indian men to come calling on somebody's farmhouse or to be walking in the streets of Jamestown. But at an appointed time, they all attack. Men, women, and children, a brutal assault. To save, in their minds, their people from this potential existential threat. On the outskirts of the settlement of Virginia, of the colony, it is incredibly deadly. And some of these farms and outlying areas lose dozens of people. Not so much in Jamestown itself, because there had been at the very last minute a tip-off. One of these Powhatan men who had been converted by the colonists to Christianity feels the need to betray the plot at the last minute in the town of Jamestown, so they're able to better defend themselves, and that helps thwart this attack. Now, they did kill about a third of the colonists. Well, out of 1,000 people, they killed more than 300 people. But it was not successful in terms of eliminating the colonists or forcing them out. In fact, as you'll see in your reading, you're going to read all about this attack. What it does is give the colonists the rationale in their minds to flip the script, to then try to simply exterminate the Powhatan. We have this second all-out war between the colonists and the Powhatan as a result that drags on for months. During which time there is a royal takeover of the colony. What I mean by that is, up to this point, the Virginia Company had been granted a self-governing charter, a document that allowed the Virginia Company to essentially run the colony itself as it saw fit. No more. Now it would be run directly by a governor appointed by the king, who answered to king and parliament, the legislative lawmaking body of England, the representative body. So there would now be a royally appointed governor and council that answered to king and parliament back in London. You might ask yourself at this point, if this had been such a disaster as to go through 2 years where you barely made it, 2 more that got even worse, the starving times, 4 more years after that, a war with the Powhatan, a second all-out war where you nearly got wiped out at the beginning of it, and rewind to the beginning of the lecture. What was the whole point of this colony?
Make money.
Right, and they have not done that yet. They just barely have been able to survive and avoid being another Roanoke. So why would the Crown and Parliament want to take over? Well, they could foresee the future. And here we get back to John Rolfe. He gets remembered for the whole Pocahontas thing, makes its way into our popular culture and lore, but his great contribution to the colony of Virginia actually lies in something else, tobacco. The English and others had known about tobacco for a long time. They come to the New World, and tobacco is one of the things that had never existed in Europe or Africa or Asia. They'd never seen it. They see that the Indians grew it and dried it and smoked it and enjoyed it. They enjoyed it too. In fact, the Virginians had attempted to grow and sell tobacco. Remember, cash crops was a thing that you might use to make a profit. Problem is, nobody back in Europe liked it. The stuff that came from Virginia was no good. But John Rolfe had been to the New World before. He had been to the Caribbean, and he had gotten tobacco from the Caribbean that he took back with him that people actually did like. So he had sort of encountered the good shit, if you will. But what's all the land in the Caribbean being used for? Sugarcane, right? There's no room to grow tobacco down there. So the genius of John Rolfe was to take the seeds from the Caribbean tobacco and bring them to Virginia. The Caribbean has the good strain of tobacco, but no land that's not being used already. Virginia has land to be used, but nothing good to grow. Perfect marriage. So the Virginians began growing this strain of tobacco that Rolfe brings in, and that is going to be the thing that makes Virginia go. That is what's going to be the thing that makes a tremendous profit for anybody who's anybody in Virginia, and by proxy, king and parliament. So successful will this be as a cash crop that all the colonies immediately surrounding Virginia will follow suit, including Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina. For the soil and climate of that region are ideal for growing this particular strain of tobacco. Questions? Here's a rendering that shows you really how the colonists viewed this attack in 1622. It is brutal, sparing no one, and I think here is how, in their minds, they interpreted what had happened as a sort of stabbing in the back. But again, that they use as their rationale to try to exterminate a people that they have this racist view of just inferior human beings or an inferior culture. That ultimately, if I didn't mention this, there is a second piece from that second all-out war, and the whole damn thing happens all over again in the 1640s. But nonetheless, by that time, they were making big-time money off tobacco. Look at this ad from a newspaper in Liverpool, a city in northwestern England. Tobacco for sale by auction at George's Coffee House in Liverpool, and this would not be uncommon. This is how goods were sold back in those days, ads out in newspapers. At George's Coffee House in Liverpool on Tuesday, the 22nd day of August, 275 hogsheads of fine James River tobacco, as in tobacco from Virginia. Hogshead, by the way, is a huge barrel, huge wooden barrel. So that's a lot. 275 of those is a ton of tobacco. It's going to make people a ton of money. And merchants in England could then turn around and sell this stuff, to France or to the Netherlands or, to the German provinces or wherever else and make big time profit. I love this rendering here. Probably a coffee house or a tavern of some sort where people are drinking and smoking tobacco in pipes. This guy had a little too much of something. He's puking. Got a kid in there for some reason. I'm not sure why that would be the case, but he's had too much of something too, but it's cool because the dog is going to eat it. So there's that. And then you've got this little imp demon looking kind of thing going on here that I've yet to figure out what that's all about. But the point being that tobacco becomes all the rage in high and middle European society. And this demand is what's going to drive production in colonies like Virginia. So we've gotten to about the mid-1600s. I just want to point out that there are, as I've alluded to, other English colonies by this point. And this is a shitty map in a lot of ways. Number one, it doesn't show you that all of this is inhabited by various different Native American peoples, but it does show you the different sort of colonial footprints, if you will. We mentioned the Spanish down here at St. Augustine. Here is Virginia. Here is Maryland. The Swedish are there, but only very, very briefly. What would later become Delaware and New Jersey. The Dutch settled on Long Island and Manhattan Island and the Hudson River Valley, which was briefly New Amsterdam, which is today what?
New York.
New York, because the English took it from the Dutch and gave it an English name as opposed to a Dutch one. Next time we're going to look here at Plymouth, where the Pilgrims settle, Massachusetts, where the Puritans do, including Boston, and then the colonies that branch off from that, including Rhode Island and Connecticut. So this whole region here is known as New England, and that's where we'll go on Tuesday. Here are the French up here in Canada, what was known as New France, up and down the St. Lawrence River Valley. So Virginia at this time is about to experience a population explosion. And there's a great effort at recruiting people to the colony, both to run what would be envisioned as large tobacco plantations and for sort of lower class people, to people of less means to come over and to actually work those plantations. And this population growth is generated in large measure by what's known as the headright system. So at that time, the trip from England to the New World across the Atlantic Ocean was very expensive. Imagine if today you would buy an airline ticket to Australia, pay $3,000. Expensive trip that most people couldn't afford to pay. But with a headright system, if you were wealthy and you could afford to pay the trip, just for making the trip, the government would give you 50 acres of land. Let's make the trash can from here. Not even close. Okay. 50 acres just for making a trip. And remember what I said, with these people of means, that's the attraction of the colonies. That's the attraction of the New World, land. So the minute you set foot in Virginia, you're going to get 50 acres of good land. But these are well-born, well-off people. They're not going to be the ones out in the tobacco fields doing the hard work. For this, they have indentured servitude, where they, in cities like Liverpool and Bristol and London, they would recruit poor people, people who are out of work, people who can't find a job, people whose wages are abysmal, and they would say, look, sign this contract. Sign this here contract. We're going to get you a free trip to the New World, free trip to Virginia. What's the catch? The catch is that when you sign this contract, you are now indentured. This is an indenture contract. Meaning whoever owns that contract owns the rights to your labor for the period stipulated in the contract. You work for that person doing whatever they want you to do for that period, usually about 7 years, in order to pay back the value of the free trip to the New World that you were given. And of course to pay for your living expenses all along the way. So you sign the contract, you sign away your freedom and labor for a period of about 7 years, and then you're free. Now, these people were not slaves. They were treated poorly like slaves sometimes, and often had months or years tacked onto their contracts. For example, if a woman got pregnant, there immediately was 9 more months tacked onto your indenture contract, and so on. These contracts could be bought and sold, even though that wasn't technically supposed to be the case. But this is the system of recruitment of poor folks from England to get laborers onto these tobacco farms. Now let me tie it back in with the headright system now. For what happens in practice, these merchant ships, captains, come into the colony with these shiploads of people who are indentured with these indenture contracts, and they sell the contracts to people who were already in Virginia that had gotten their 50-acre plots in the headright system, remember? And for every one of those contracts that these wealthy folks purchase, and therefore for every laborer that they bring into the colony, for every indentured servant, for every head, they get the right to 50 more acres. For every indentured servant you bring into the colony, 50 more acres. Imagine that. If you've got the wealth enough to make it to Virginia, you get 50 acres. And if you've got the wealth to bring in, 10 indentured servants, do the math on that. You now have a big-ass plantation with indentured servants to work it to grow tobacco for you. This makes a small group of people very, very wealthy in pretty short order. They gobble up all of the good land up and down the rivers and streams and the land that the Virginians had taken from the Powhatan in the preceding wars. They now have plantations with sometimes dozens of indentured servants. They become a class of elites ruling over a very wealthy colony. They become known as the grandees. And by the late 1600s, you have a colony now that has extreme social polarization. It has become polarized. Meaning on the one hand, one pole like the poles of the earth, at the top you have this small group of very wealthy grandees who were tight with the governor and royal council. And then you have these indentured servants on the bottom who, remember, don't remain servants forever. When their contracts are up, they will become free. And by the 1660s, 70s, you start to see waves of these people becoming free. Now, I want to make something very clear, because this gets confused regularly. There's nothing in that indenture contract that says, hey, when you're free, you get 50 acres too. It doesn't say that. There is no promise to indentured servants of land of their own. The expectation for the people who devised this system is that the indentured servants would be happy and fine with remaining on whatever plantation and working for wages for the grandees. That make sense? Well, guess what? They're like everybody else. They want land too. They want land of their own, a farm of their own. Maybe they didn't have delusions of grandeur of becoming grandees, although I bet some of them did. But it turns out that a large portion of these indentured servants, when they become free, are not content to stay on the plantation and work for wages. They want to go get their own land. And herein lies the major problem. Because by the 1670s, all the good land is taken. All the land that the colonists had gained from the Powhatan in those series of wars, all the land that's suitable for tobacco cultivation, close to navigable waterways for transportation, it's all taken up by the grandees, gobbled up in the headright system. So where do these former indentured servants start to go? They don't go back home. Say it? Yeah, they start wandering out to the west, beyond the reaches of the absolute colonial boundary at the time, the frontier. Wandering into land and looking around and thinking, oh, this looks nice. I don't see an Indian village here. This must be no one's land. I'll settle here. I'll build a farmhouse here and start to till this ground. And then some months later, a Powhatan hunting party will come along and wonder, who in the hell are these people? Violence ensues, for what they have done is encroached upon and squatted on Powhatan hunting land. Land that did not belong to the colony. Causing trouble with the Powhatan. And fighting along the frontier. We're not just talking about one or two people here either. So in sum, what has happened is former indentured servants, upon becoming free, wander out west, encroach upon and take Powhatan land, leading to fighting between these former indentured servants and the Indians, which might well have just led to a fourth Anglo-Powhatan war between the colony and the Indians, but these former indentured servants don't have the support of the colonial leadership. They don't have the support of the grandees or the governor or the council, because those people, in a sense, wanted to have their cake and eat it too. That is, they're making a fortune off tobacco, but what they wanted too was a sort of French-style deerskin trade with the Indians on top of that. And you can't have that if you have another war with the Indians, you see. So these former indentured servants are left to their own devices in fighting the Indians on the frontier. You with me? Enter Nathaniel Bacon. I'll pause and say right above him you see the name of Richard Brevhorn. I only have that on there because he writes the letters that you're going to read for the first quiz. He's an indentured servant is all. Now, Nathaniel Bacon is not an indentured servant or a former indentured servant. In fact, he is a man of some wealth and means and education. What business does he have showing up on the frontier in 1675-76, trying to organize these poor colonists into a militia to fight back against Powhatan attacks in organized fashion? Because you could argue, I think you could make the case without calling this too much hyperbole, that Nathaniel Bacon is a genocidal maniac who would rather than work diplomatically with the Native Americans, he would just like to kill them all because he views them as hopelessly inferior people. And so he makes common cause with these former indentured servants who are at war along the frontier with the Powhatan. And he beseeches the leadership of the colony, hey, we need support here. Our people are getting killed in Indian attacks. We need to mount another war against these people. And the leadership of the colony says, no. In fact, what you're doing is detrimental to what we're trying to do. The response of Nathaniel Bacon is basically, well, then F you, we'll turn on you too. And what Bacon's rebellion becomes is simultaneously a war against the Powhatan and the leadership of the colony. As one historian put it, it's a civil war masquerading as an Indian war. It is an internal Virginia colonial civil war of poor former indentured servants versus the grandees and the governor. They marched on Jamestown and burned part of it to the ground. They very nearly kidnapped the governor and held him for ransom. They came pretty damn close to overthrowing the colony. But they didn't succeed. Bacon dies, the other leaders are executed. And so what's the significance? If this rebellion failed, what's the significance of Bacon's rebellion? Well, it just sent a pretty clear message that indentured servitude is causing you more problems than it is worth, because it has created this polarized society in which you have an aggrieved lower class that has different ideas about how to move forward than these grandees. And they begin to think, okay, what other labor force might we use? If indentured servitude has proven itself to be a long-term failure, or we can envision that being the case, if it's tearing our society apart, isn't there some other labor force? Related question, is there some way that we could get these poor people to envision having some connection or common cause with these wealthy people at the top of our polarized society? And my God, what if you could come up with one solution to both of those things? And you only needed to look to the south, to South Carolina, in the Low Country, where planters had settled, having moved from the English island colony of Barbados, sugar colony. You remember earlier in this lecture when I said all the Indians in the Caribbean died, mostly from disease, and these European countries that have colonized those islands use that land for growing sugarcane asterisk. Who is actually growing the sugarcane? Enslaved peoples from various parts of Africa. African slaves they repopulate the entire Caribbean with enslaved people from Ghana and Angola and Benin. And when those planters move from Barbados and establish what becomes South Carolina, they bring enslaved peoples with them. They use slave labor there. They realize, if you've ever been to the area around Charleston or Savannah, Georgia, the low country is low and swampy. Not suitable for cultivating sugarcane, but ideal for cultivating rice. Those South Carolina planters import slaves by the thousands to grow rice, which surpasses tobacco as the colony's most valuable export and most valuable cash crop. And so when Virginia realizes their indentured servant system is failing them, they look to the South and say, why don't we stop importing so many indentured servants and turn instead to African slave labor? And by the 1700s, there are very few indentured servants, but there are plenty of slaves, replacing them as the labor force growing tobacco still. And remember, I said Virginia had another problem too. Social polarization, aggrieved, upset, lower class people. And consider this, if you were to take in 1700 an indentured servant and sit them side by side with a slave, what is the most obvious, visible, physical difference between those two individuals? Skin color. Indentured servants were white. Those are white people from England. Slaves are black. And so when they write slavery into law in these colonies, in Virginia and others, it is written into law as a racial system that says blackness equals slavery, because what is the flip side of that? Whiteness equals freedom. You have just sent the signal to those poor white folks that they will never again occupy the bottom rung of society based upon only the virtue of the color of their skin. They'll never be slaves. In fact, if they work hard, they could aspire themselves to slave ownership, and that would be the thing. Purchasing human beings would be the thing which would let you rise in the social ladder. In other words, they now occupy, immediately when those laws go into place, a privileged position in society simply because they are white. And so Virginia solves both of its problems by introducing a racially based, what we call chattel system of slave labor, and importing black people from the Caribbean and West Africa as slaves. I mentioned a chattel system. What does that mean? Chattel slavery. Well, it carries, in this case, with that racial element, as I mentioned, but what it means at its core is a system in which slaves are property. A system in which, legally speaking, slaves are considered property to be bought and sold, in which the condition of the child follows that of the mother. That is, if the mother has a child and she is a slave, that child is a slave for life too. These people do not ever become free as with indentured servitude. It is a system which involves an attempt to commodify human beings. The essence of such a system being a person with a price. And this becomes the labor force of all the southern colonies producing the cash crops of tobacco and rice. In fact, those southern colonies will become what historians call a slave society. A society in which everything rests upon this foundation of chattel slavery, which itself rests upon a foundation of violence. This all makes sense? See what I've forgotten. By 1700, 1 in 8 people in Virginia was a slave. And that number in the 1700s is going to grow, dramatically in fact. And we, in the third lecture of the semester next week, will look at all 13 colonies in which slavery was illegal in all of them. And there were slaves in the northern colonies too, but it's only in the colonies south of the Mason-Dixon line where you see slaves used as a labor force for cultivating cash crops. Questions? Anything at all? Anything unclear?
What were the consequences?
The consequences are that Virginia has turned permanently away from indentured servitude and towards this new system. The consequences are that you have engendered white solidarity between very wealthy people and poor white people by convincing poor white people that they have this privileged position simply because of the color of their skin, because you have introduced this chattel/racial system. There are all kinds of implications of this. You've put in place the foundations for what would become a slave society in the southern colonies. And if you want to think about the long-term consequences of this, you have built the foundations of a society that after the Revolution would be these southern states, which are so fundamentally different and so dependent upon the institution of slavery that they would find cause to leave the United States 70, 80 years after independence and fight a civil war for their own independence. So the consequences are profound the more that you sort of think about it. What else? Yes?
Were they like scared? Because you know how you said the Indians were scared of being outnumbered? Why weren't they, the colonists, scared that
Eventually they are very scared. All it takes is 1 or 2 attempts at a slave rebellion for them to be very, very frightened of that and to safeguard themselves in every way possible. In that third lecture, I'll talk about the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, where slaves, by the way, eventually would outnumber white people dramatically, and due to people of their descendants do to this day. But they will eventually be terrified, in fact, of that. And especially because in the early 1800s in Haiti, in Saint-Domingue, there's a slave revolution. The slaves actually overthrow the white government and install their own government, and that has reverberations in the southern, by that time, states of the United States. So to answer your question, they are very afraid. That didn't stop them from continuing to import slaves, although the early U.S. government does stop the importation of slaves from abroad at one point. But the answer is violence and heavily arming themselves and tightly controlling the movements of slaves, and ensuring that they can't ever learn to read and write and these sort of things. There's all kinds of measures that are taken to sort of give them, I guess you might say, peace of mind, if that answers your question. What else? All right, well, that is all I've got. I will not see you all on Tuesday, is that correct? It's the other cohort? All right, well, be on the lookout, though, for me to post the lecture recording.